Democrats seemingly have a deep bench with Governors Gretchen Whitmer, Wes Moore, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jasmine Crockett, Governors Andy Beshear and Gavin Newsom. As we said, these are very different Democrats with very different perspectives. So how do you Democrats, according to the polls, seemingly have not been the big tent party. Every demographic almost is swinging to Republicans. How do Democrats become that big tent party once again?
You've got to stop focusing on the individual talent and start thinking about broad populist themed messages. Yes, with a democratic bent of support for the middle class, support for labor unions, support for LGBTQ and equal opportunity. But the message now is more populist. People are kind of tired of being shamed into fitting into these boxes of propriety and such. And there are multiple messages that work for multiple different demographics that can ultimately support a person going to the voting booth and hitting the D. I am far less concerned with the individuals of Democratic politics and the individual personalities. I think that's a rabbit hole that we've been down since the era of Barack Obama that hasn't really served us well. I am far more concerned with somebody who is from outside of the game, but willing to talk reasonable, populist, left-leaning stuff, and who can make that message across the board. And frankly, when I say somebody, that's probably a coalition of folks who look like a whole bunch of different people who are actively participating in the democratic processes.
It seems like Democrats are having a difficult time in finding a way to cohesively fight Donald Trump's agenda here because he's moving 80 miles a minute here. And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer earlier said, we're not going to lay on the tracks for every issue. We're going to pick our few key issues and go all the way with that. Even at the joint address to Congress, protests seemed disjointed. Some people were wearing different colors. Some people were standing up and yelling. And there was no cohesive strategy behind that. Social media from Democrats has been mocked. I mean, what is the way to fight Donald Trump's agenda if you're a Democrat?
Well, you have to do what you can. And I do think that ultimately there have to be people who are willing to disrupt, like Al Green, and there also have to be people who are willing to burn it down. We have seen Republicans from the Freedom Caucus through the Mama Bears and in school boards on the local level being willing to stop proceedings. And frankly, all the way up through January 6th, I'm not arguing for Democrats turning to violence like we saw that day, but we have seen Democrats think that certain behaviors, certain tactics are beneath them. And ultimately what that has amounted to is a party who looks weak because it looks like they're not willing to pull out all the stops in order to stop proceedings when they see these extraordinarily unfair and punishing the middle class policies that are just imminently passing. When you don't have the House, the Senate, or the presidency, there are very few things that you can do, but you can disrupt. That's why I was extraordinarily disappointed to see 9-10 members of the Democratic House caucus vote to censure Representative Al Green. And there are certain positions, there are certain opportunities where if you are a caucus or chamber leader, you have the opportunity to force your caucus into taking a caucus position that says we are all going to support Al Green or there will be ramifications for you on committees, on seniority and things of that nature. I was disappointed to see Hakeem Jeffries not do that, but there are inside baseball kind of how you play the game tactics that can support any types of reward or punishment for members who are not willing to get on board. But you have to develop positions and exploit the opportunities where the caucus has to be united, and you have to hold them to that.
We've seen the pendulum swing time and time again of parties' popularity. Republicans faced a popularity crisis years ago. Now Democrats are facing those historic low numbers. I mean, I guess my last question to you is, how do Democrats make their party cool again? How do they make it popular again? How do they make people excited to be a Democrat?
Well, it's going to be very difficult to do because from what we've seen over the last 5 years, but particularly in the past election cycle, big tech, who controls so much of the messaging that people see now, is squarely in the bag for the Trump administration and the Republican Party. So you've got to figure out a way to get back to grassroots. How do you talk to neighbors outside of Instagram or TikTok when those messages are being manipulated? How are you able to engage with folks? And I think that it goes back to being in churches, being in the community meetings. We're starting to see an uptick in the Democratic town halls like we saw with Republicans in 2010. But ultimately, I am looking for a group of folks from outside of organized politics to rise in a populist fashion that's Democratic leaning and talk about how we're better united, regardless of the kind of identity politics that Democrats have pressed on their voters for the last 20 years. And frankly, the American people got a little tired of.